It was a stormy evening at Gate 12 when the retired police dog quietly broke pattern. Flights were delayed. Voices crackled over the speakers, and an older woman sat alone in the corner, arms wrapped around a warm backpack with her son's name still stitched on the flap. The K9 unit moved down the concourse in a smooth line, harnesses catching the lights, nails tapping on the tile. Halfway past her row of seats, the grey-muzzled shepherd at the centre simply stopped and leaned against his handler's hand. Instead of scanning the crowd like he was trained to do, he turned toward the woman and pulled forward, eyes locked on the faded canvas in her lap, as if tonight he had finally found what he'd been searching for. Margaret first noticed it in late October, when the air turned thin and dry and the floorboards began to complain about every step. The kitchen clock ticked a little too loudly, the fridge hummed a little too long, and the old bungalow on Willow Street felt less like a shelter and more like a hollowed-out shell. Each evening, just after the 6 o'clock news, a faint sound came from the front porch. It was not the wind rattling the screen door, not the mail truck's brakes, not the neighbours' teenage music. It was smaller, a soft tap and scrape, as if something brushed against the wooden boards and then waited. The first time she heard it, she muted the television and held her breath. The hum of the refrigerator seemed to grow. The heater clicked. A distant train called from the edge of town. The sound didn't come again, and she let herself chalk it up to the house settling, to age in the walls and in her own bones. Yet the same thing happened the next evening, and the evening after that, always near the same time, always that tiny scrape, followed by a hush that made the hairs on her arms rise. She would glance toward the hallway, feeling a small chill crawl across her shoulders, as if some invisible draft had slipped under the door. One Thursday, she shuffled to the front window and lifted the edge of the curtain with 2 fingers. Street lamp light spread across the frost-gloss steps, catching the white paint that had peeled in curling strips. Nothing moved, only the faint trail of something pressed into the thin shine of frost, like half-moons leading up to her welcome mat. She frowned, pulling the cardigan closer around her chest. Her heart had begun beating a little too fast for a woman just standing in her own front room. It was silly, she told herself. The house had always creaked when the weather changed. The marks could be from a raccoon, or the mail carrier, or her own shoes scuffing the step without her noticing. The next night, she left the living room lamp on and settled into her chair with the worn backpack across her knees. Its straps were frayed, its fabric rubbed shiny at the edges, and the faint smell of old coffee and something metallic still clung to it. Her fingers traced the stitched name on the top flap as she listened for the 6 o'clock sound. Right on time. The boards outside gave a careful, muffled thump. Then came a soft metallic jingle, so slight she almost missed it under the television anchor's voice. Her chest tightened. That was no wind. No branch. It was the particular bright ring of something touching metal and then going still. She leaned forward, the backpack pressed tight against her. The living room light drew a pale rectangle on the floor, ending just before the front door. In that narrow border, she saw the shadow of something move past. Not tall enough to be a person, not low enough to be a squirrel. It slid across the crack at the bottom and then vanished. Her pulse drummed in her ears. For a moment she imagined calling someone, asking a neighbour to come look, then felt foolish. It's nothing. Maggie, she whispered to herself. Just the house. Just your imagination running little circles. Her voice sounded too loud, swallowed quickly by the room. When she finally worked up the nerve to open the door, the air outside bit at her cheek. The porch boards were damp and cold under her slippers. On the faded welcome mat, the small half-moon impressions appeared again, a neat pair of them pressed side by side, pointing at the door as if they had been waiting. On the top step sat a stainless steel bowl she did not remember putting there. A thin line of water ringed its inside, catching the porch light in a wavering reflection. Beside it, a single short hair clung to the wood, pale against the dark. She reached down, feeling the faint ache in her knees, and the hair stuck to her fingertip. A breath of warm air brushed the back of her ankle, startling her so sharply she almost lost her balance. She spun, catching the doorframe, catching her own breath. At the edge of the porch, just beyond the spill of light, something solid shifted and then withdrew into the dark. Nails clicking once against the board before the quiet closed in again. The wind fluttered the edge of her housecoat, but the warmth at her ankle lingered, like a touch that had meant to reassure and then thought better of it. She stepped back inside, locking the deadbolt with hands that trembled more than she liked. Whatever was happening, it was not just the house breathing. Something out there knew the way to her door. Chapter 2: The Visitor at the Steps. The next morning, the frost had thickened into a sugar crust across the porch. When Margaret opened the door to fetch the paper, she saw the marks again, clearer now. Neat pairs of ovals led from the yard to the bowl, then clustered by the threshold, as if something had paced in a small, patient circle while she slept. She huffed out a breath that formed a little cloud in the cold. Could be anything, she murmured, though she could not think of many anythings that arrived at the same time each evening and left such tidy tracks. The bowl was where she had found it the night before, now empty and dry, a faint ring along its base marking where it had sat. All day she found her thoughts drifting back to the steps, while she washed the dinner plate that had become her habit for one, While the radio murmured a country song in the kitchen, she kept picturing the shadow sliding past the door. Each time, her skin prickled, a mix of unease and an odd, inexplicable hope she refused to name. By late afternoon, she moved the worn backpack from the chair to the small bench near the front hall. Its weight felt familiar in her hands, the way it had when she used to hand it over with a packed lunch and a crooked smile. She set it down carefully, facing the door, as if someone might step in and reach for it out of habit. At 6 o'clock, she turned off the television entirely. The house seemed to hold its breath with her. The heater clicked off, leaving a soft ringing in her ears. Then, faint but unmistakable, came the scrape of claws on wood, a pause, and that bright metallic jingle she had heard before, like a tag brushing against the side of a bowl. She inched down the hallway until she could see the outline of the door and the thin wash of street lamp light beneath it. A shadow crossed that strip of light and stopped, perfectly still, as if listening back from the other side. Her heartbeat thudded so hard it felt almost visible beneath her sweater. This time, when she opened the door, she did it slowly, keeping the chain latched. A rush of cold air slipped in, sharp enough to sting her nose. Just beyond the threshold, something sat at the top of the steps, broad-shouldered and steady, with a darker shape strapped across its back and chest like a harness. Two pale eyes reflected the porch light in quick, intelligent glints. They held each other's gaze for a suspended, impossible moment. The creature's chest rose and fell, breath misting in the cold. A soft whine curled out. Not quite a cry, not quite a greeting. Something threaded with recognition. One paw shifted, claws clicking once on the board, and she saw a faded strip of nylon hanging from the harness, ending in an empty ring. "Goodness," she whispered, more to herself than to it. You're not wild at all. Are you?" Her voice broke on the last word. The head tilted, ears pricking at the sound, as if testing her tone for danger. The bowl at her feet showed a smear of moisture along one side, as though a tongue had dragged there and then paused. The creature stayed where it was, making no move to cross the threshold, but also refusing to flee. After a few seconds, it lowered its head, gaze dropping to the backpack visible through the crack of the door behind her. A low huff of breath escaped it, and its nose lifted just enough to draw in the air, scenting something that made its tail give a tiny, uncertain sway. Her eyes burned unexpectedly. She loosened the chain with clumsy fingers and opened the door wider, the backpack now in full view on the bench. "Are you looking for someone?" she asked, the question leaving her mouth before she could think better of it. The figures ears flicked again, and it leaned forward almost imperceptibly, as though the answer might be sitting just inside. A car door slammed somewhere down the street, and the spell snapped. The creature stepped back, then turned and moved down the steps in 3 silent, powerful motions. At the edge of the yard, it glanced back once, the porchlight catching the grey threaded through its coat and the outline of letters stitched along its harness. Then it slipped into the dark between houses and was gone. She stood in the open doorway long enough for her fingers to grow numb and her breath to turn ragged and shallow. There was no denying it now. Whatever had been visiting her steps was trained, purposeful, and wearing the ghosts of a job across its shoulders. And somehow, it had acted as if the worn backpack inside her house still meant something. Chapter 3: Echoes of the Badge. The backpack had belonged to Daniel. Even now, years after the funeral, Margaret found it hard to think his name without feeling an echo in her chest, as if the sound knocked against a door that would not open. He had been her only child, a lanky boy who grew into a careful man, then into an officer whose work had taken him farther from her porch than she liked. He had chosen the path she feared most and, somehow, the one that had made him happiest. First came the academy, then the long nights on patrol, and finally the transfer to a unit that brought him home one evening with a partner whose presence filled her tiny kitchen. Big paws on her linoleum, inquisitive eyes, and a quiet, attentive stillness that made her admit, grudgingly, that this pairing might not be all bad. She remembered how Daniel had set the backpack on her table that first visit, laughing when his partner nudged it with a firm nose, demanding that it be placed where he could see it. "He watches my stuff better than I do," he had said, pride and affection braided into his voice. "We go nowhere without this. It's like his idea of a tether." The partner's name had been Rowan. Margaret remembered the patch on his vest, the way the embroidered letters curved over his shoulders. She remembered how he would lie across the doorway when Daniel took off his boots, as if guarding the threshold, as if deciding who was allowed in and who was allowed out. She had made a joke about needing to show identification to reach her own stove. Those were the good years, before everything splintered. The calls grew more serious. The stories Daniel couldn't tell her stacked behind his eyes. Rowan's focus sharpened, his playfulness reserved for quiet moments in her backyard. Once, during a visit, a backfire from a truck down the street sent Rowan racing to Daniel's side, planting himself there in a stance that said, unmistakably, "I have you," just in case. When the incident happened, it did not happen in her town. She received the call at her kitchen table, the morning sun barely clearing the maple in the yard. There had been no dramatics, just a voice on the line, a tone she had heard in other mothers' stories and never dreamed would be meant for her. Daniel was gone before she understood all the words. Rowan, she was told, had survived. For months afterward, she avoided anything that reminded her of that unit. She did not drive past the station. She turned off the television when uniforms appeared on the screen. Once, she saw a patrol vehicle parked outside the grocery store, and the sight of the dark shape in the back seat was enough to send her back to her car with an empty cart. The ache was not just grief for her son, but a jagged, unfinished question about the partner left behind. It was the chief who finally mentioned Rowan to her in person. They stood outside the church after a memorial event, the wind tugging at the corners of the folded flag in her hands. Hess still working, the chief had said gently. He didn't want to stop. They transferred him to a larger city unit. Hes taken it hard in his own way. You know, they do. She had nodded, but couldn't bring herself to ask where. Once, years ago now, she had gone with a friend to a training day at the fairgrounds, determined to face the distance rather than let it keep growing. Dozens of handlers moved across the grass with their partners, colours and patches from different departments. She had stayed near the back of the crowd, fingers locked around the strap of her purse, eyes scanning every vest for a familiar arrangement of letters. She thought she saw him near one of the orange cones. Older, thicker through the shoulders, the grey around his muzzle more pronounced. The handler beside him was a stranger. Rowan's gaze had skimmed the crowd, passed over her, then doubled back and snagged on her face for a heartbeat. His ears lifted, his tail giving a tiny, uncertain flick, as though he almost recognized the outline of her grief. She had left before the demonstration ended, her throat too tight to swallow water from the concession stand. That night, she put Daniel's backpack on the bench by the front door and left it there, telling herself it was just because she had nowhere else to keep it. She did not admit that part of her imagined a familiar nose finding its way back to it, even from far away. Now, standing in front of the same bench, the memory of that distant gaze fused with the image of the visitor on her porch. Broad shoulders, grey threading through the coat, the hint of rounded letters across a harness. A creature that refused to cross the threshold but stared at the backpack as if it were a beacon. Trust had been broken once. She knew, not by betrayal, but by the sharp blade of circumstance. That kind of wound did not heal cleanly for humans or for those who worked beside them. She pressed her hand against the backpack's flap, feeling the stiffness of the fabric, the outline of a badge holder still tucked inside. If it's you, she whispered into the quiet hallway, I don't know how you found your way back, and I don't know if I'm brave enough to open that door all the way. The answer, for the moment, was the steady ticking of the clock and the echo of nails she was certain she could hear in the boards of her memory. Chapter 4. When the threshold shifted. The storm came in late on a Sunday, dragging a low ceiling of clouds over town and smearing the streetlights into hazy halos. Rain hammered the roof in uneven bursts, then settled into a steady drumming that made the windows tremble. Margaret moved through the house in wool socks and an old sweatshirt, the backpack never far from her reach. By evening, the wind found every weakness in the bungalow, snaking in under doors and between window panes. The front porch light flickered once and then steadied, turning the rain into silver threads beyond the glass. She heated a bowl of soup she barely tasted, each distant rumble pulling her mind back to the steps outside. At precisely 6, a new sound joined the storm. It came not as the usual soft scrape, but as a firm thud against the door, followed by a low, muffled sound that vibrated through the wood. Something solid leaned its weight there, as if measuring the barrier, as if asking permission rather than testing it. Her body responded before her mind did. She set the spoon down with a clatter, heart climbing into her throat. The room seemed to tilt slightly, the familiar furniture taking on the flat, unreal look of a photograph. She wiped her hands on a dish towel and walked toward the hallway, feeling each step in the tender bones of her feet. The closer she came to the door, the more distinct the sound became. A faint whine threaded through the storm, rising and falling with the wind. There was a gentle scrape of nails, a jingle of metal, and underneath it all the heavy, patient rhythm of breathing. It was as though a living metronome waited on the other side, counting out seconds that stretched impossibly long. She tightened her grip on the deadbolt, then slowly turned it. When she pulled the door open, the storm reached in with greedy hands, flinging cold air and rain against her face. Standing in the middle of it all, framed by the yellow porch light, was the visitor. His coat was soaked dark, drops of water clinging to the thick fur around his chest. The harness on his back shone with dampness. The stitched letters softened but still legible. Rowan. The name rose in her mind before she could stop it. His eyes found hers immediately. Not darting, not pleading, simply waiting. He took a single step forward, careful, deliberate, then stopped at the threshold, as if some rule still held him in place. Rain pattered around them, pinging against the empty bowl at his side. "Come on," she said quietly, surprised at how steady her voice sounded. "You'll freeze out there." She stepped back, creating space in the doorway. For a heartbeat he remained still, muscles braced, as if fighting an internal order that told him outside was his domain and inside was off limits. Then he lifted his head, sniffed the air that carried her scent and the familiar ghost of Daniels, and crossed the threshold. The moment his paws touched the entryway rug, the bungalow changed. The house that had felt hollow for so long suddenly seemed to exhale, filling itself with the weight of another presence. Rowan shook once, sending a spray of cold droplets across the floor, then stilled, looking around with that same calm, assessing gaze she remembered from a kitchen long ago. He walked past her without brushing against her legs, as if respecting a space he sensed she might still need. His nose found the backpack on the bench almost immediately. He halted, head lowering slowly until it rested against the canvas. A long, shuddering breath left him, and his tail gave a restrained but unmistakable wag, the movement small and reverent. Margaret's throat tightened. "You remember?" she whispered. She moved closer, fingers hovering above his damp fur before finally settling gently on his neck. The heat of him seeped into her palm, chasing away the chill that had lived in her hands for years. He stayed still, accepting the touch without leaning in, as if offering her full control over how far this reunion would reach. After a moment, he turned and walked toward the living room, pausing at the doorway. He glanced back at her, then lowered himself across the threshold in a familiar pose, front paws just inside the room, back paws in the hall. The position was protective and practical, a living barrier that watched both directions. It was exactly how he used to place himself when Daniel visited, between worlds, between dangers she could not see. She sank into her chair, the storm's noise now a distant backdrop to the quiet inside. Rowan's breathing settled into a slow, reassuring rhythm. Every so often his ears twitched at a sound outside, but his gaze always drifted back to the backpack when the house fell still again. The question of how he had found his way here, after transfers and years and changed roads, hovered between them like an unanswered prayer. As the night wore on, she dozed and woke in small fragments, each time finding him in the same place, a calm weight at the heart of her home. When the wind finally died and the rain eased to a whisper, he rose, padded to the bench, and nudged the backpack with his nose toward her feet. It was a small, deliberate gesture, one that stirred something fierce and aching in her chest. He was not just visiting, he was asking her to move, to pick up something she had been avoiding for far too long. The invitation had been sitting on her kitchen table for weeks, its edges curling slightly from the steam of tea kettles and the weight of grocery lists set on top of it. The academy planned a small ceremony in Daniel's honor, a plaque in a hallway, a few words from people who had known him on calls she never heard about. They wanted her there. Of course. They had called twice to say so gently. Each time she picked up the envelope, her chest tightened. The idea of travel made her stomach knot. She had not flown since before Daniel's passing, and the thought of walking through an airport filled with uniforms, announcements, and the distant bark of working partners felt like willingly stepping into a room built from her own ghosts. Rowan had settled into a rhythm in her home, though nothing about his presence felt ordinary. He slept near the front door, woke when she did, and trailed her with a quiet steadiness that was almost like a shadow-given fur and warmth. When she moved toward the backpack, he watched with an intensity that bordered on reverence, as if it were a relic he had been entrusted to guard. One chilly morning, she finally slid the backpack onto the table and unzipped it. The smell that rose out was faint but immediate. Worn fabric, a hint of motor oil, paper, and something else that her mind stubbornly labelled as Daniel, even if she knew scents did not hold names. Rowan stood beside her, nose hovering just above the opening, his whole body taut with attention. Inside, along with old reports and a bent pen, lay a small laminated badge clipped to a coil of key rings. The plastic had clouded a little with age, but the photo was clear. Daniel in uniform, Rowan beside him, tongue just visible in a rare, off-duty moment. Margaret's thumb brushed the surface, and she inhaled slowly to keep her hands from shaking. The phone rang that afternoon, the Academy's number appearing on the screen. She almost let it go to voicemail, then glanced at Rowan. He lay by the door, eyes open, watching her with a calm patience that seemed to say, "I will be here either way." She picked up. The voice on the other end was kind, not pushy, but there was an urgency beneath it. These ceremonies did not come again. After she hung up, she pulled an old suitcase from the closet. The action made the house feel different, as if the walls straightened with attention. Rowan rose immediately, padding over to sniff the case, his nose tracing along the zipper and handles. When she placed the backpack inside, his ears flicked, and a soft whine escaped him, quiet but unmistakably distressed. "I'm just looking," she told him, more to soothe herself than him. "It doesn't mean I'm going." Still, his restlessness grew. He paced between the suitcase and the front door, nails clicking on the hardwood in a rhythm that matched the racing of her thoughts. Each time she zipped the case, he planted himself in front of it, eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her feel as though she were being weighed. 2 days before the ceremony, a storm warning rolled across the television screen. Heavy winds, possible delays, messy roads to the city. It felt like a permission slip to stay home, to tell herself that circumstances had decided for her. She sat in her chair, the remote motionless in her hand, the words travel advisory swimming on the screen. Rowan stood from his place by the door and walked straight to her chair. Without hesitation, He pressed his head into her lap, the weight of his skull a solid, grounding pressure against her thighs. She felt the warmth of his breath through her jeans, the steady in and out that contrasted with her own shallow, uncertain breaths. His eyes lifted, meeting hers, and for a moment she saw not just an animal pleading for a walk, but a partner calling her bluff. "Are you telling me to go?" she asked, voice thin. He huffed once, then turned and nudged the backpack where it leaned against the table leg. The motion was firm, almost insistent, pushing the canvas toward her feet. It slid an inch, then another, the sound loud in the quiet room. The day of the flight dawned grey and raw. She loaded the suitcase into a neighbour's car, hands clumsy on the handle. Rowan paced in tight circles near the door, then planted himself in the frame when she tried to step outside without the backpack. She sighed, lifted it onto her shoulder, and only then did he move, allowing her to pass. At the airport, everything felt too bright and too loud. Announcements echoed off high ceilings. Wheels rattled over tile, and 1,000 unfamiliar scents layered themselves into one thick, disorienting cloud. She clutched the warm backpack to her chest as she shuffled through the security line, acutely aware of her own heartbeat and the tremble in her knees. Beyond the checkpoint, she found Gate 12 at the far end of a long corridor. The gate area was quieter, the buzz of conversation softened by distance. A row of seats faced the wide windows, where the tarmac spread out under low clouds. She chose a chair near the corner, sat down slowly, and gathered the backpack into her arms like something fragile. Down the corridor, a unit of handlers in dark uniforms walked in a neat line, partners at their sides. Their vests and patches were different, some from nearby departments, some from farther away, all gathered for a joint training exercise she had heard about on the news. They moved with practiced ease, scanning, pausing, moving on. The line like a living river of focus and discipline. Margaret shrank a little into her seat, instinctively trying to make herself small. She had come this far, but every nerve in her body felt exposed, as if one wrong sound would crack her resolve. She drew the backpack closer, fingers laced through the straps, eyes fixed on the floor. Somewhere inside the case, at her feet, the laminated badge pressed against folded clothes and neatly packed fears. It was too late to turn back, yet part of her still wondered if she had made a mistake in coming at all. The handler's footsteps approached in a steady cadence, soft thuds and the occasional jingle of metal reaching her ears before she saw them. Margaret kept her gaze low, watching only the shadows pass along the scuffed tile near her shoes. Each pair of moving shapes was accompanied by a different rhythm of breathing, of nails lightly ticking, of gear shifting against fabric. As the group drew level with gate 12, a new sound broke the pattern. One set of nails slowed, scraping lightly as they tried to dig in. A harness strap creaked as it took unexpected strain. The handler at the center of the line murmured something low and firm, but the resistance did not ease. The flow of the unit faltered, then rippled back as those behind adjusted to the interruption. Margaret's fingers clenched around the backpack. She told herself not to look. Curiosity won, anyway. She lifted her eyes just as one of the partners broke formation by a single, insistent step. His coat was darker now than in her memories. Grey sprayed heavier along his muzzle, but the set of his ears and the shape of his shoulders were as familiar as the curve of her own hand. Rowan's gaze swept the gate area once, then locked onto her. Time thinned. The murmurs of other passengers, the gate agents' announcements, the rolling wheels, all of it slid into the background. Rowan took another step toward her, pulling his handler slightly off balance. The man held the harness, surprised, then followed the line of the partner's stare to the woman in the corner seat clutching a battered backpack. "Ma'am," the handler said gently, staying a few feet away. "He seems interested in you. Is everything all right?" His tone was a careful blend of professionalism and puzzled concern, the kind used when something unexpected but not immediately dangerous occurred. Rowan closed the remaining distance with one decisive move, stopping just shy of her knees. He lowered his head, nose pressing against the worn canvas with a soft exhale. The backpack shifted under the pressure. Margaret felt the warmth of his breath seep through the fabric, stirring the long faded scent of motor oil, paper, and the trace of cologne that had once clung to her son's uniform. Her throat tightened. She lifted one shaking hand and rested it lightly on Rowan's neck. His fur was thicker than she remembered, but the steady pulse beneath it felt the same. He did not flinch. Instead, he leaned into her touch by the smallest fraction, an almost imperceptible acknowledgement that bridged years and miles and changes neither had chosen. "He used to work with my boy," she managed, the words rough-edged. "Daniel. Years ago. This was his." She lifted the backpack slightly, so the handler could see the stitched name on the flap. The man's eyes widened. "I've heard that name," he said quietly. "In training stories. They said Rowan's first handler was... They said he didn't come home." His gaze dropped to the partner, then back to her. "We've been flying through this airport for exercises all year. Every time we connect here, he drags me toward this end of the terminal. I thought he just liked the windows." Margaret breathed in, the air shaking its way into her lungs. Pieces slid together with startling clarity. the backpack on the bench by her door, the way she had opened the windows on breezy days, letting the air move through the hallway where it sat, the stormy nights when Rowan had appeared on her porch, drawn by a scent that had ridden the wind from an old canvas tether. "Has been finding his way back," she whispered. "All this time, he's been trying to get to this." She pressed the backpack closer to her chest, then carefully unzipped the front pocket. The laminated badge slid into her palm, its edges cool and smooth. She held it up so Rowan could see. The photo caught the terminal light. Daniel's smile frozen beside a younger version of the partner now standing before her. Rowan's nose touched the plastic, then moved to her wrist. He licked once, a slow, deliberate gesture that felt less like a demand and more like an answer. His body relaxed, the tension that had been wound tight in his muscles easing in a visible ripple. For the first time since she had seen him on her porch, his tail wagged freely, a full, unguarded arc. Around them, the world resumed its motion. Passengers angled their phones away, embarrassed by their own urge to record. The handler gave her a moment, then cleared his throat softly. "Ma'am, after today's work, he's due for retirement papers," he said. "Has earned it twice over. I've got a good home waiting for him. But if he keeps choosing your door, we might need to talk about what he's trying to tell both of us." Tears blurred the text on the gate screen. Margaret blinked them away, not wanting to miss a single detail of Rowan's face. "I thought I was done opening that kind of door," she admitted. Losing one partner was hard enough. She looked down at him. He met her gaze calmly, as if he had already accounted for that fear and chosen her anyway. She swallowed hard, then nodded once to the handler. "Let's talk after the flight," she said. "If he's willing to share his retirement, I think I can find room on my porch. And in the rest of the house." The words surprised her with their certainty, but as she spoke them, something in her chest loosened, a knot dissolving that she had carried for far too long. Rowan settled at her feet while she waited for boarding, his body angled so he could see both the gate and the corridor. Every so often, he flicked a glance up at her, as if checking that she remained, that the tether held. She rested one hand on his back, the other wrapped around the backpack. For the first time in years, sitting at a gate in a noisy airport, she did not feel like a woman surrounded by ghosts. She felt like someone arriving where she was meant to be. Rowan's retirement paperwork moved faster than Margaret expected. Within a few weeks of the ceremony, his handler drove out to Willow Street in a department vehicle, the partner riding in the back with his nose pressed to the glass as if he already recognized the route. The house that had once felt too quiet now hummed with a low, anticipatory energy. When the car door opened, Rowan leapt out with controlled eagerness, landing neatly on the driveway. He glanced once at the yard, then trotted straight to the front steps, nails ticking on the familiar boards. The stainless steel bowl still sat near the mat, polished now, a fresh line of water catching the thin winter sun. He sniffed it briefly, then looked back at Margaret, waiting. "You remember where we left things?" she said, her smile tremulous but real. She stepped aside and let him cross the threshold without hesitation this time. He moved through the hallway as if tracing a map embedded in his pores, heading straight for the bench where the backpack rested. He paused to touch it with his nose, then continued into the living room and chose a spot by her chair, lying down with a sigh that sounded suspiciously like contentment. Their days settled into gentle patterns. In the mornings, she brewed coffee while he stretched by the front door, his collar giving a soft jingle when he shook out his fur. They walked slow circuits around the block, his pace adjusting naturally to hers. Neighbours leaned on rakes and paused mid-shovel to wave, some recognising the patch still attached to his old harness, others simply noting the new pair that now shared the sidewalk. On Thursdays, when she ventured into town, Rowan rode in the back seat of her neighbour's car, head resting near the cracked window, nose testing the currents of air. They stopped at the diner on Main Street, where the waitress had known Margaret for decades. At first, Rowan lay under the table with impeccable restraint, eyes half closed. After a few weeks, he began to accept the occasional pat from regulars, his tail thumping softly against the floor in approval. Winter slipped quietly into spring, the snow melting into small rivers along the curb. On damp mornings, their walks took them past the elementary school, where children pointed from behind the fence as Rowan moved with dignified calm at her side. Margaret found herself telling abbreviated versions of his story to teachers and crossing guards, always careful with the details, always ending with the same line. "He worked with my boy. Now he keeps an eye on me." Inside the house, Rowan's presence reshaped the way she moved. She no longer hesitated at the top of the basement stairs, knowing he would plant himself at the threshold if anything below felt off. When she climbed onto a step stool to reach a high shelf, his gaze followed her intently, a silent reminder to be cautious. If she stayed in her chair too long, he nudged her hand with his nose, coaxing her up for a walk or a stretch, or simply to stand at the window and watch the light change. The backpack remained on its bench, no longer a shrine, but not yet an ordinary object either. Some evenings, she unzipped it and let Rowan rest his head inside for a moment, breathing in whatever fragments of the past still clung there. Then she zipped it closed and set it back, feeling oddly as though the two of them were folding the memory away together, not to forget, but to keep it from spilling everywhere. Summer brought longer days and the soft chorus of crickets around the porch. They sat outside most evenings. She in her worn lawn chair. He stretched across the boards, watching the street with a protective ease that was more habit than tension now. Cars passed, bicycles rattled by, and the smell of grilled dinners drifted from neighbouring yards. Once in a while, a passing patrol car slowed, the officer inside lifting a hand in quiet salute. One Saturday, at the town's small fair, the chief asked if she and Rowan would mind standing near the information booth for a while. Nothing formal, he said. Just people like to see the ones who've done the work, even when they're off duty. She agreed, surprised by how natural it felt to answer questions, to watch children's faces soften from awe to affection as Rowan leaned into their careful hands. In those moments, she realized that the story she told about him had shifted. It was no longer only about service and loss. It was about companionship, about the way a life could bend and still hold, about a partner who had taken his watch from one side of a threshold to another. The ache in her chest remained, but it had changed texture, less jagged, more like something worn smooth by fingers reaching for it day after day. By the time the leaves began to turn, their shared rhythms felt as natural as breathing. Rowan knew when the mail arrived and when her favourite radio show came on. She knew when he wanted to stand at the window and when he needed to nudge her toward bed because she'd fallen asleep in her chair again. Their lives had woven around each other, a quiet pattern visible in scuffed floorboards, flattened rug fibres, and the way her hand now reached down without thinking, always finding the top of his head waiting there. A year after that first day at Gate 12, Margaret found herself back at the airport, though the reason this time felt different. She was flying to meet her new granddaughter, a small arrival who had come into the world with her father's eyes, and a fierce cry, the nurses said, sounded like determination. The thought of holding that child made her chest swell with something softer than grief, though the two emotions still sat side by side. Rowan walked at her pace through the terminal, wearing a new vest that read, "Retired K9, please ask to pet," in tidy letters. People did ask, more than Shed expected. Parents knelt with their children. College students reached out tentative hands, and business travellers slipped off their headphones for a moment to scratch his ears. Each time, she told a bit of their story, adjusting the details to the listener, always ending with, "He used to work with my son. Now he keeps me company getting into trouble." When they reached Gate 12, she chose the same corner seat as before. The backpack across her knees this time was newer, filled with baby blankets and a knitted hat, but tucked inside the front pocket was the laminated badge. She carried it not as a weight now, but as a thread connecting past and present, a small bridge between a man who was gone and the tiny life she was about to meet. Rowan settled at her feet, sighing as if recognizing the spot. He glanced once down the corridor where units still occasionally walked past for training, then let his head rest on her shoe. The collar around his neck jingled softly when he shifted, the sound blending with the murmur of voices and rolling wheels. Gate agents, cool boarding groups. Someone laughed too loudly nearby, and somewhere beyond, a plane's engines hummed. She reached down and traced the line of his spine with familiar fingers. "You brought me back here," she said, her voice more grateful than fragile. "I would have stayed on that porch forever if you hadn't started scratching at my door." His ear flicked, acknowledging the truth without vanity. He had simply followed the scent of something unfinished until it led them both to where they needed to be. As boarding time approached, a young officer in a crisp uniform approached, hat tucked under his arm. "Ma'am?" he asked politely. "Are you Mrs. Carver?" At her nod, he continued, cheeks faintly flushed. "I just wanted to say, we still talk about your son at the academy, and about Rowan. They're kind of a legend for the new class. In a quiet way." She smiled, the kind that reached the corners of her eyes. "He was just doing his job," she replied. Both of them were. She glanced at Rowan, who lifted his head as if understanding his name in both past and present tense. The story doesn't end at the call, though it keeps going, in little places, in porches and gates and waiting rooms. Before he left, the officer asked if he might take a photo. She agreed, surprised at how proud she felt when Rowan sat tall beside her, ears forward, gaze steady. Later, she imagined that photo might sit in some hallway, a reminder that service did not disappear when the uniform came off. It came home. It walked familiar streets. It sat quietly at the feet of someone who needed it. When her group was called, she stood carefully, knees protesting in their familiar way. Rowan rose with her, staying close but not crowding, giving her space to balance the new backpack and the old badge. They moved toward the jet bridge together, each step measured, unhurried, the way you walk when you are not running from something anymore but toward someone waiting. At the threshold between terminal and plane, she paused and looked back once at the rows of chairs, the gate sign, the stretch of corridor where she had once sat hugging her sorrow. The space looked different now, less like a wound and more like a chapter. Rowan leaned lightly against her leg, a warm nudge that said, without words, that it was all right to keep moving. Later, settled into her seat, she felt his head rest gently against her calf, the steady weight anchoring her in the present. She thought of Daniel, of the long arc from that kitchen table to this humming cabin in the sky, of the way a partner had carried a piece of him back to her and then stayed. Outside, clouds rose to meet them, soft and layered, like pages opening under a careful hand. For the first time in a long while, as the plane lifted and the ground slipped away, she felt utterly, quietly certain of one simple thing. She was glad they had found each other again in this life, and that the story still had more gentle miles left to go. If this story touched your heart, drop a simple 1 in the comments to let us know you were here. Your support keeps these gentle stories alive. Don't forget to subscribe and stay with us, because the next story might just be the one that finds you when you least expect it.